Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Tuesday, December 2nd. Quite a few things on my mind today. Of course, the main thing being Trump's latest neocon project in Venezuela. I mean, we might as well just face it. The neocons never went away. They're running the show in D.C. That's all Trump's presidency has been about, is foreign policy, and not, for the most part, good foreign policy. But a couple other doodads, too. We've got this comment from Elon Musk floating around about how work is going to be optional in the future because of AI and the not too distant future, and that money will be obsolete. You know, this, of course, is complete nonsense, and we'll talk about that. First thing I wanted to talk about also is that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, is officially closed down, having declared victory in eliminating government waste. I guess there's some ongoing activities to fire political enemies, which is fine by me as long as, people get fired. The problem is that we keep hiring new government workers, maybe not in the same chair as the person who just got fired, but just to put some perspective on this, supposedly at one time, and this is words coming out of Elon Musk's mouth, not Trump's or any politicians, which means you should have believed him even more in most cases, but not in this case. I think this was a bit of idealism where Musk was saying he thought we could cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. When he said 2 trillion, I'm pretty sure he meant 2 trillion a year. So just to put some numbers in perspective here, and I'll go back a few presidents so you can kind of see a pattern that's forming here. In fact, I'll go back to Jimmy Carter. Okay. So Jimmy Carter left Ronald Reagan. I know these numbers by heart now. He left Ronald Reagan a government that was spending $590 billion a year. So just over $500 billion, if you could believe that. And Ronald Reagan was president for 8 years, at the end of which it was spending a little over $1 trillion. So he didn't quite double it, but boy, he gave it the old Gipper try. And then George H.W. Bush, the elder Bush, got in there for 4 years. And in 4 years, he managed to take federal spending from $1 trillion to 1.4. Okay. So over that entire small government period, where the government was gutted and we had Wild West capitalism. Remember that? Well, the government went from spending $500 billion a year to $1.5 trillion. So it almost tripled in terms of size when you measure it in dollars. And really, there's a good argument that there's really no other measurement matters. I mean, it doesn't matter if you spend it on the military or you spend it on so-called welfare programs. It's money that's been taken out of productive use and blown on some kind of unproductive consumption by the government. Now, of course, if it blows people up, you might have a preference. Since you're wasting the money anyway, why don't you waste it on some poor people? And that would be fine with me. I would just like the money not to be stolen in the first place. So in any case, HW turns over this $1.4 trillion government, almost triple the size of the one inherited from Carter, and over to Clinton. And Clinton increases it from 1.4 trillion to 1.8 trillion. Okay, or about 27%, 25, doing the math in my head there. And then George W. Bush, also known as the chimp, comes in, and he increases it from 1.8 trillion to 3 trillion. So again, he doesn't quite double it, but kind of see a pattern forming here. Bush came in, I'm a free market guy, and also on a humble foreign policy. That was what he said we should have, we shouldn't be the policeman of the world. So he then said during the financial crisis, which he did his part to create. Now, of course, all these booms and busts are created mostly by the Federal Reserve, but presidents do their part to kind of augment or at least cheer on and also spend their way into helping to make them worse. And that's Republican or Democrat. So Bush said, "Well, I had to abandon the free market to save it." And then we got, the bailout at TARP and all that. But just to keep the numbers going, now we've gone from 1.8 trillion to 3 trillion. Obama gets in there, and his first year he spends like 3.8 trillion. And it looks like, okay, well, maybe it's just going to go straight up. But guess what? Years 2 and 3 and 4 with Obama, or 3, 4, and 5, one of the two, spending actually goes down. And it goes down for the federal government considerably. And when I say it goes down, I don't mean the way they say it goes down now, where it's like, well, we planned on increasing it, 700 billion, but we only increased it 600 billion. So that's a cut. No, Obama's year over year spending actually went down for several years. Now, you can credit the Republicans for some of that and all those, what did they call it when they hit a certain wall? And I can't remember now. The sequestration, right? But I mean, it actually worked. And if you actually look at the economy, it was sequestration that you could credit as much as anything else with finally getting the economy out of the multi-year recession that the Federal Reserve created. Bush helped make worse, and Obama certainly helped make worse until, this brief legislation, which cut everybody's hands off, allowed the economy to somewhat recover. So at the end of Obama's term, the spending had gone down, and then it went back up his last year, and he actually spent 3.9 trillion his last year. So he took it from 3 trillion to 3.9 trillion. Call that 30%, 33%, something like that. So it went up a little faster than Clinton, but nowhere near in percentage terms what it went up with Gipper, Reagan, or Bush, or either of the Bushes. So then Trump comes in, and he's going to drain the swamp. And Trump takes over a government that spent $3.9 trillion in Obama's last full year. And his government turns over to Biden a government spending 6.5 trillion. All right, now you can attribute 2 trillion to the CARES Act. That was in 2020, but he also increased it 200 billion. He increased it twice as fast in the 3 years prior to COVID. So 2017 to 2019, spending went up on an average of 200 billion a year. And during the Obama presidency, it went up an average of 100 billion a year. I think it was like 112. So just about twice as fast under Bush before COVID happened. But he turns over a government spending 6.5 trillion. And you notice we have these crises and we have the one time, oh, we just got to do this one time thing. And then the number never goes down. Okay. That's what happened after 2008, 9. And that's what happened after COVID. But Biden gets a government that's spending $6.5 trillion. And over his 4 years, he increases it to 6.9 trillion, about 100 billion a year, about the same as Obama. Now, Trump, whose presidency was supposedly undermined by the Russia investigation and all the impeachments and everything, and okay, that didn't force him to sign any spending bills, but okay. He's come in now, and we were going to cut 2 trillion a year off that, 6.9 trillion. We were going to get under 5 trillion again. And the first fiscal year, now part of the fiscal year 25, which ended in September, 4 months of that, a third of that, Biden was still president. So we got to always, try to be fair. But the government, after the whole Doge effort and all the blustering and and all the supposedly starving children because of this irresponsible slashing of government. The government spent $7.1 trillion in fiscal year 25, and it's projected to spend 7.3 trillion, and that's without a war in Venezuela, whatever that might cost, in this next fiscal year, the first full year under Trump. It will again go up 200 billion over, the year before. So we have the possibility that Trump will be at 7.3 trillion at the end of his second year, which means he will have increased federal spending as much as Biden did in all 4 years that he was president. So there's that. So much for the whole. I mean, was it all just a scam? I think Elon Musk actually believed it, and then somewhere along the line he figured out nobody's cutting any spending. What are you, crazy? This was all for the rubes. This is all for the so-called MAGA crowd, especially like the libertarian end, like me, right? But I wasn't a MAGA person. I was just a libertarian who was dumb enough to vote for Trump. Although I had such low expectations that I thought, well, I wanted to make a statement about the Libertarian Party, nominating a guy who wore masks and chose to put this on social media at Thanksgiving and brag about his socially distanced Thanksgiving. I said, no, we I'm not going along anymore. All right. Sooner or later, give me another Michael Bodnarik. I don't care if he gets 64 votes, and I'll be one of them. But until then, forget it. So anyway, the whole Doge thing was either a scam or, I mean, I can't think of it as anything else because nothing's going to happen. They made all this noise. They took apart USAID. Why? Because it was a Democrat program. And that's fine. It's just that if they spend more money overall, it really didn't help us that much. Now, USAID was doing a lot of no good. Okay. And I guess they were doing some good by socialist standards, meaning they were helping some poor people, I think in other countries. So, and Rubio himself, when they took down the USAID sign, said, well, we're going to try to keep the good parts in other departments. But, it was definitely a bad operation. It was funding all sorts of Democrat media. It was awful. And then amongst all that awfulness, I guess they were helping a few people. And hopefully they'll keep doing that, although we shouldn't even be doing that with the government. It should be a private charity. But so that moves on to what could make the spending even worse, and that's this Venezuela thing. And I wrote something I'll link to about the whole Venezuela looming debacle. Now, the caveat is Trump has, been very, very bellicose towards North Korea, fire and fury. Remember that from the first term? And Iran. Of course, he really did bomb Iran. So that's no good. But he has then so far backed off before we get this full scale kind of war. Now, that said, a war with North Korea would be nuclear. Nuclear. Did I say that? I've made fun of W. Bush mispronouncing nuclear so long I can't even say it the right way anymore. Nuclear, nuclear, and a war with Iran would be another Iraq. It would be worse than Iraq. It would be harder to win than Iraq, and we kind of didn't win that one anyway. Definitely didn't win Afghanistan. I'm not sure. I say this based on the word of people I trust, like Colonel Douglas McGregor, who's been on the show. I mean, they still only have a $12 billion military budget. Their whole GDP is like a third of the U.S. military budget, their whole GDP. So, take it with a grain of salt, figure out what it is. I'm told it would be very hard. Now, again, Russia's numbers look very small, but they're having no trouble defeating Ukraine with all of NATO funding it. So hard to say what's true. When nobody's reliable, it's you just have to, make your best guess, use your anecdotal experience. So in any case, there's obviously no reason for Trump to be doing this other than just like the first administration, despite all the talk about draining the swamp and all the no more forever wars, it's an interesting little trick there. No more forever wars. So as long as they don't last forever, then they're okay, I guess. And that's probably what they'll say about Venezuela. And the reason I brought up those other wars that could have been longer, Venezuela could shape up quite a bit like H.W. Bush's intervention in Panama, where he arrests Noriega and, it's over very quickly and his approval rating goes, skyrockets, only to plummet when he raises taxes, despite us reading his lips. So, I'm thinking people around Trump are telling him that, and they're filling him up with dreams of oil, which that whole oil thing doesn't make a lot of sense. And also his legacy, which is going to be more persuasive to Trump than anything. People will think you're great. He's still starving for all the people who hate him in the national media to be nice to him. Like he makes comments. It's so scary. The psychological implications of this. It's like, you people, you're never very nice. Like if the New York Times or the Washington Post was nice to him or CNN, he'd turn right around, like he did with Mondami. Of course, there's more to that story, but so anyway, I don't really know what the overall motivation is, like the real motivation, if there is a real motivation other than just finding some, win in a year that started out with such optimism and has turned into such a disaster for Trump and the Republicans. I mean, he's got his core that will never ever leave him, but he can't win an election with that core. Nobody can win an election with just their true believers. They've got to get some people on the fence, independents. Trump got some libertarians. I don't know how many there were. I'd guess, less than 2 million. And how many of those voted, I don't know. But he's going to lose a big part of those and even a big part of the MAGA crowd. So some of the MAGA crowd, I think, and this is just me putting my thumb in the air, as long as you do immigration and have a terrible trade policy that they think is going to help them, then they're with you. And if, you went to war, and I said this at the beginning of the Trump movement phenomenon, is that I really do give him personal credit for injecting the anti-war part. If he had come out as an immigration hawk and mercantilist on the economy and just said all the things he was going to eventually do, bomb Syria, just basically be a neocon overseas, then I think the most of the MAGA crowd would have gone along. I think it's a minority that are anti-war. I think maybe it's a minority because, and one of the things the polls show is that a majority of MAGA Republicans support the intervention in Venezuela, but a significant minority oppose it strongly. And if he loses that significant minority, I mean, he's not going to run again, but if he were to run again, he would lose that election. Not to mention independents and Democrats. I mean, we had Democrats voting for Trump last time. The Democratic Party got so bad that lots of people just said, look, this guy's an idiot, but I'm going to give him a chance, Let's and again, like somebody like me is like, yeah, he's a bull in a china shop. That's just what we need in there, turn him loose. I don't care what he breaks. Anything he breaks is going to be positive if it's in Washington, D.C. So he hasn't done any of that, though. He spent this whole year after those first few months giving a few interviews, letting Elon Musk post on Twitter. He spent the whole year on foreign policy. and he claims to be trying to be making peace. But what would be different if Jeb Bush was in office as far as Middle East policy goes? I don't know. I don't think we might go boots on the ground back into the Middle East, but even the Bushes know how unpopular that is. And the course they've taken, which is just, you know, massively fund Israel and green light all their worst excesses. Yeah, I think, Jeb Bush would be about the same. Trump operating under the entire delusion in Washington and much of the country that the U.S. can mediate the Ukraine war when, as Daniel McAdams first pointed out and came on the show to talk about, the U.S. is a party to the Ukraine war. In fact, the U.S. is the main other party besides Russia in the Ukraine war. The Ukrainians are the victims of both sides. I mean, they've been used. I've got to do a separate episode on Zelensky because that whole story is very interesting. I've got to dig up the sources. When the war first started, I think I did a podcast or wrote an article or one of the two about what the empire was saying about Zelensky before he won the election. And it was not all good. In fact, it was mostly not good. Like they didn't want him in there. And the fact that he spoke Russian, not Ukrainian, the fact that he had said we need to talk to Putin, there's no other way out of this. And this is before the invasion. Remember, this is 2019 when the only thing that had happened had been Crimea, and then they had this civil war going on. But something happened after he got in that changed his approach. And whether that's pressure, like outright threats, we're going to kill you and all your family, whether it's they bought him off. We've heard he's made a lot of money off this war. It's hard to say. We don't know, but something changed because he was elected to end the hostilities with Russia. And that's why all those people in Eastern Ukraine voted for him because he was a Russian speaker and because he had said that he was going to go and negotiate with Putin. And by the end of 2021, he's shelling civilian neighborhoods on Russia's border. So what happened? Fascinating story. Maybe someday we'll find out. I have no idea right now, but I will dig up those resources. So anyway, Trump is trying to mediate this fight in Ukraine that the U.S. is a party to, but doesn't have any boots on the ground except for the ones they don't tell you about, which are there. And now he's starting on Venezuela. So a lot of the MAGA crowd, even some of the ones who might not care so much about staying out of wars, are like, wait a minute, when are you going to work on our stuff? When are you going to work on how bad it is for the average middle class person right now fighting price inflation caused, by the way, one of the great things that Trump got away with, and just nobody questions it, is blaming the inflation on Biden when inflation is completely a function of the money supply. In fact, I'm going to try and show you something on that just so you can see the real story here, because Biden certainly, did not help inflation. But if you look at the Fed's balance sheet, okay, and let me get a view that will 1 year, they're only giving me, I'm going to share this screen with you. So when you look at the Fed's balance sheet, that's how much money, like everything on the Fed's balance sheet was purchased with dollars that they created out of thin air. So when they say that they're buying assets like mortgage-backed securities, et cetera, they are, they're creating new money and putting it out there in the reserve accounts of banks so that they can lend it to other people. So they're increasing the money supply. And take a look at this screen. Okay. This is their balance sheet way back in 2008 before the first crisis. Here's where their balance sheet was $890 billion, less than a trillion. And then we had the financial crisis and they more than doubled it, like in the first year. And then by the time they were done, they took it from under a trillion all the way to 4.4 trillion. And then they started right here in February of 2018 to try to reduce it. They always promised back in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, we're going to get it back to where it was, like back to where it was under a trillion or on some point on a trajectory, that's years ahead of where that was. So of course, like they peaked out around 4.4 and a half, and they start tapering. And remember September 2009, they got down to 3.7. Okay. So they got down to 4.5 times what it was before the financial crisis. And then they started buying assets again because we had a financial crisis looming. This is before COVID. And they started increasing again. And then this is January. Here's February 2020. Trump signs the CARES Act for COVID. And that, along with the shutdowns, and here's how much money they created just that year. We're still in 2020. We're still in 2020. Okay, here's January 21. So they went from about 4 trillion to 7.3 trillion. They created $3.3 trillion while Trump was still president to try and address this crisis. And then from there, Biden takes over, and Biden's got his own spending bill that's got to be paid for with printed money. They take it from 7.3 to 8.9. So they increase it another 1.6 trillion, but nowhere near as much as the bulk of the so-called, what the real definition of inflation, which is increasing the money supply of money and credit, that all happened under Trump. And that's why you're paying higher prices. Period. I mean, the tariffs don't help. All these people are saying, well, there's some knock-on effects of some of them, and da 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 da. Here's why you're paying higher prices. Now, since where do we peak here? Somewhere in 2022, I think July 2022, the Fed announced we're going to start decreasing the money supply again. And they have. I mean, they have sucked $2.4 trillion out of the money supply. Now, if you're a longtime listener to the show, you know that this increase, from 3.7 or really starting in 2020 from 4 to 8.9 was not all that it seemed because Powell kind of locked up 2 trillion of that in the reverse repo market. I won't go into all those details, but it kind of sidelined that money for a couple of years. So really, you could make this 4 to 8.9. Really, it's more like 4 to 7.9 because most of this 2 trillion here, yeah, it's rolling off the Fed's balance sheet, but it's also leaking out of the reverse repo market. So the real tightening has just started, really. And he's slowed it way down. In fact, if you've been following me saying long before he started slowing down, I think when the reverse repo market is drained, he's going to stop tightening. And he didn't stop, but he slowed it way down. It's trickling out now. It used to be coming out much faster. So, okay, so the money supply is not increasing right now. In fact, it has decreased a little substantively. One of the things, I can show you one more thing. That's the Fed's balance sheet, but the real measure of what's available to people out in the economy, that's a measure, it's not the whole measure either, is the the M2 money supply. So the Fed creates new money, gives it to banks, and banks are able to kind of multiply that effect because they used to operate on fractional reserve. Now the fraction's zero. So they can take $100 that they got and put it in your checking account, and you're able to withdraw that anytime you want, but they still lend it out. So they lend out, it used to be 90% of your money. Now it's 100% to somebody else. Now it's in two checking accounts at once. It's kind of doubled the money supply. Well, it hasn't doubled the money supply. It's doubled that $100. That $100 the Fed put into the banks has now become $200 in the economy. And that's why I'll share this with you. That's why this M2 money supply has such a bigger number. Now, again, that's been going up, since before the financial crisis. There it is historically. Here's 2007. It didn't change that much in trajectory until 2020. And then I'll go to the 10-year view. Look what happens in 2020. So it's at around 15 trillion. When the Fed's balance sheet is at 4 trillion, the money supply is measured by M2. This doesn't count euro dollars, and there's all kinds of caveats, but it's at 15 because of that multiplier effect I told you about. And then look what happens in 2020. So again, where I have the cursor right now is about where Biden took over. Okay. So from the gray bar, that's a recession bar that they put those bars up so you know when there was a recession. From right before that bar, well, actually, you could go back to 2017 on this graph. That's where it was when Trump took over. Okay, so he takes over in January. It's 13 trillion. By the time he hands it over to Biden, it's 19 trillion. Now, Biden, again, he comes in, starts spending, and the Fed inflates, and it gets from 19 to 21, but it went from 13 to 19 under Trump. And during the COVID shutdowns and all the spending that Trump signed off on, it went from 15 to 19. All right. So it increased by $4 trillion and then only by 2 trillion under Biden. And then it starts going down during all that tapering. Now, of course, it started going up again. And what you're seeing there, I didn't mean to get into this much technical. What you're seeing there is, even though the money supply is slightly shrinking, the fact that they're lowering interest rates is encouraging the banks to lend out what money they have. So don't forget, they have all these huge reserves at the Fed that they never had before 2008. So even with less money to lend, the fact that the Fed is paying them less on their reserves is encouraging them to lend more of what they do have, which is actually very reckless. I mean, that's like, encouraging a lot of bad activity as well. But I mean, the whole manipulating interest rates is a bad thing. It's socialist, it's central planning. The fact that the entire economy is really under the control of one guy. I mean, he might not decide where money is invested, but he decides how much. He decides how much money there is to invest, at what rate generally it's going to be invested. That's not a capitalist economy as long as you have the Fed. So anyway, getting back to tying this back into Venezuela, we don't know. Venezuela will not increase spending that much. I mean, that's one thing I should clarify. People talk about the wars, and the wars, of course, are bad morally, and they do cost us money a lot. But they're a small percentage, really, of overall military spending. We have, like, the year after Afghanistan, like in September after Afghanistan 21, ended and before the Ukraine war started, like they still raised military spending, even though we just ended a war. Because most of what we pay for is this global standing army and this huge bureaucracy. It's a ripoff. I mean, even if we're not at war, we're paying the same. It's 200,000 people basically, like I said, being warehoused overseas, most of whom are not fighting anybody and never will fight anybody. We got 50,000 in Europe. We got 25,000 more in North Korea. We've got another 50 or 60,000 in Japan. So it's just a big ripoff. And of course, we have to pay to feed these people, pay to house them, pay to equip them. I mean, there's that quote by Oppenheimer, that essay actually, which I want to do a podcast about, that there's two ways to acquire wealth. One is the economic means by voluntary trade, and the other is the political means. And the military has always, throughout history, been the chief political means for ripping people off. Even when you're in a real war, like that should cost 100 billion and it costs 800 billion. That's always been the story going back to the knights in shining armor. And of course, climate change is the new wave, right? We've exhausted, we can't really squeeze any more out of military. So now we've got climate change, and that's gonna be, another leg up for the political means. But no good is going to come out of Venezuela. I think it's gotta pretty much end the MAGA movement as we know it today, which is mostly bad, but has some good aspects to it. The very small percentage of people who care about cutting government spending, the significant minority among MAGA that truly don't want to see the U.S. in any wars or even supporting these wars in Eastern Europe or the Mideast. Okay. You're going to lose them, or they're just not going to care anymore. I mean, I certainly will never vote for a Republican or a Democrat again. I mean, unless Thomas Massey wins the nomination nominally as a Republican, but more libertarian than our last libertarian presidential candidate. In fact, our last one, two, three, four, five. How many have we had since 2004? That was our last good one. So, however many that's been, Massey will be more libertarian than all those, back to Michael Bodnarik. But I mean, I'm not saying that's ever going to happen. So, and who's driving this inside the administration? Neocons. Everyone knows Marco Rubio has this whole Cuba obsession. He's Cuban, he's got family. And, just like Victoria Nuland was Ukrainian and had a personal family, whatever stake in overthrowing the government of Ukraine back in 2014, Marco Rubio's got all kinds of personal interests, which, it's like he should have to recuse himself from this part of foreign policy. And you've got Elliot Abrams, who's just like, I don't know, a moss that has grown on the Washington military bureaucracy. He's been around since Reagan and wanting Latin American intervention all the way since back then. And of course, he's a neocon. He's Jewish, so he's got some personal or familial connections to Israel. And believe it or not, Venezuela has something to do with Israel. They deal with Iran, and all things Iran are bad Israel. So he's got that. He's also a big China hawk, like all the neocons are, and way too many of the MAGA people are. So, by the way, China is not a threat to the United States. The fact that they keep getting richer is because they're not building military bases on. They've got one base outside their borders, and we are a threat to them. That's the reality of the situation. We've been talking about threatening them militarily for this entire century, and all they've done is got richer because they became more capitalist. And they're certainly not any kind of laissez-faire free market, but they're at least as capitalist as the United States. They spend a smaller percentage. Government spending makes up a smaller percentage of the Chinese GDP than it makes up of the US GDP. So think about that for a minute. Communist China. So, it just seems like a Venezuela intervention that can come off as successful by Washington standards and the national media standards. I don't know if they'll ever give Trump credit for anything, but if you notice, all the hate stopped when he bombed Syria both times, his first administration. All of a sudden, how presidential. You're bombing somebody. And I think the heat's dialed down in the national media anyway, because really Trump's not threatening anything anymore. But not that they won't impeach him as soon as they get the House, but whatever. We've seen that show before. We can do that again. But what this could do is kill anything that's good about the so-called MAGA movement, because all the people who will stick with Trump no matter what will say, "Look, we told you were dumb to doubt him. All you people who didn't stick with him, look, it's been a big success." Like the other U.S. interventions. And then, he'll be friendly with the neo. I mean, did they ever go away? Abrams has been in there forever. Pompeo was his first Secretary of State. Or I'm sorry, not the first, because he had Rex Tillerson, got him out of the way fast. And in comes neocon Pompeo. Now he's got neocon Rubio. He had John Bolton in there in the first administration. The demise of the neocons was greatly exaggerated to begin with. And I just see that if he does this Venezuela thing, it's going to be back to them running the show. I mean, it'll just be another Bush administration, whoever comes next. If that's JD Vance, I mean, he was already there before it was politically expedient for him to become MAGA. And he'll be back. He'll be a Bush acolyte. And I should mention Pete Hegseth. I mean, Hegseth is right out of the Bush mafia. And he's acting just like it as the defense secretary. And this bombing of boats thousands of miles away, I mean, there's just no defense of that. It's funny. I put on social media something to that effect. Did you say the same thing when Obama did it? Yeah, Junior, I did. I pull up the article from 2012. I wrote about it for the Washington Times, nitwits. So anyway, yeah, I think we're nearing the end of this so-called MAGA phenomenon. The name will stick. It's great marketing. Make America great again. The next president will be claimed to be making America great again. And the foreign policy, to the extent it's even looked different under Trump, will look identical to Bush and Obama. That's what we're going to get. And I wish I could give you better news, but that's the tea leaves as this guy sees them. I wanted to also talk really quick before we sign off here about this thing with Elon Musk. And then really, I mean, it's been a thing for many years now that AI, this huge technological leap forward, is going to mean that no one's going to have to work anymore. And people are talking about this as like this new thing that we've got to deal with. How are we going to deal with this? And what was the guy who ran for president? He's a Democrat, wanted to do universal basic income. I can't remember his name. I want to send everybody $1,000 check every month. That guy, I can't remember who he was, but you know who I mean. He was saying it back then when AI replaces the jobs, we're going to have to find, things for people to do. So this is not a new story. This is a really old story. Okay. Since the Industrial Revolution, they've been predicting that, and it's mostly been socialists like Musk. Musk is a socialist. And the way I arrive at that conclusion is he says he's one. I mean, he's actually been recorded saying, I consider myself a socialist. Like a lot of industrialists. Henry Ford said the same thing. So, back in the 1880s, when before even the assembly line and mass manufacturing really got underway, you had Oscar Wilde, socialists, predicting that machines would replace human labor. Actually, it was 1891. I'm sorry. Our friend John Maynard Keynes said that his grandchildren would work 15-hour weeks because technology would, quote unquote, solve the economic problem forever. The economic problem. It'll make scarcity go away. And there was all kinds of talk about this. Of course, that didn't happen. People are still complaining they have to work too hard, to this day. And then in the 1990s, when that was the next big revolution, right? It was the internet and the technical revolution. And there was actually a best-selling book by a guy named Jeremy Rifkin called The End of Work. And that computers and the internet were like the final nail in the coffin of human labor. That was 35 years ago. So, of course, this is all nonsense. I mean, yes, it, AI will eliminate some jobs, just as the automobile eliminated the blacksmiths and the internet, the new, like Microsoft Excel itself, not to mention QuickBooks, eliminated huge amounts of jobs. If you watch like a movie from, let's say, the 1940s or 50s, and they show the workplace, you'll see like rows of desks of people that are just hammering away, keeping books, keeping records. All those jobs are gone. Okay. And over the course of the last couple hundred years, just mass extinction of jobs, but it always goes with mass creation of jobs. And one of the reasons is nobody's desires are ever satisfied. I mean, the human desire for more is unlimited. So, when cars became inexpensive, everybody bought them. And then when they became even less expensive relatively, everybody bought two, right? So nobody thinks about having, two cars. Like if you've got two people in the family, they're adults, they both have cars. No one can even imagine sharing one car to a household. When I was a kid, most households did that. And they had to like drive, like mom was trapped at home, but on the shopping days, 1 or 2 days a week, she'd drive dad to work and then she'd take the car out, to go run errands and stuff or get her hair done and then go pick up dad from work. So like people got around with one car. People got around, like my friends, both my parents worked, which was unusual at the time, but most of my friends had party lines. So not only were there, everyone knows there were no cell phones in the 70s, but also they had like a landline in their phone, but it wasn't exclusive to their house. Like several households used it. So that would make it cheaper. And like you pick up the phone and there might be people from some other household talking on it. And then you were expected to hang up. It was like an honor system. So it's called the party line, by the way. Nobody would put up with that these days. Okay. Nobody, nobody could imagine just having a landline where you had to sit in one part of the house to talk on the phone, right? With everybody listening because, you couldn't take it in a bedroom or whatever. So much less, the ear pods that I'm wearing to make sure I don't get feedback in my microphone. So no, AI is not going to eliminate scarcity. It's not going to eliminate work. People will work harder, than ever. They just won't do the tasks that could be replaced by AI. So now they'll be freed up to do new tasks. And for all the, 20 and 30 something MAGA people who think it's hip to like, make fun of the free market, well, we're always right, you nitwits. Okay. You guys wanted to regulate the internet back when Google was and Facebook were censoring you. All right, that would have prevented the entire revolution that's happened with all your heroes, Tucker Carlson and Joe Rogan and all the rest. Okay, they all now have audiences way bigger than the old networks, and you wanted to regulate and make it harder for that to happen. So I'm taking a victory lap, and I want to dunk a little on these young nitwits that think that they're being cool or this is a cool thing. Like it's never cool to support the government ever. Okay. And so there's that. And no, we will always be working. We'll always have jobs. Some people are going to go through a difficult transition and that's unavoidable. And the best way to combat that, by the way, is to deregulate the labor market. Okay. Because when people are out of work, their job that they invested 20 years in doesn't exist anymore. the last thing you need is barriers to them going somewhere else. And I mean, get rid of minimum wages, get rid of like the whole administrative state makes it harder to get a job and to create a new job. And what they need is mobility. Now, back when all the blacksmiths got put out of business, they did have a relevant skill with all that metal work for automobiles. And a lot of them like put up signs that said auto repair and horseshoeing. And then over time, the horseshoeing just went away. Now, the transition isn't always that easy, but that's how that could never happen today. In today's regulatory environment, what they did then to not suffer greatly from the emergence of the automobile, they could not do in today's regulatory environment. So the free market's always the answer. It was the answer with censorship. It would be the answer with the jobs eliminated by AI. So what we're going to get instead is the Fed saying we have to print a lot of money, a lot of subsidies. We're going to try and put a lot of people on permanent welfare, and that's not going to be good for them. It hasn't been good for the people who are now on permanent welfare. It's not going to be good for us. The rest of us in the economy will be poorer. They'll be poorer. So I know I'm just kind of a barbarian shouting in the wilderness right now, but that's the truth. And of course, the truth doesn't sell because it doesn't make anybody feel good. And America's all about feelings now, whether that's the right or the left. You know, somebody said something, some gotcha statement, and I feel good. Or, you know, the left doesn't like Trump invading Venezuela, so now I'm pro-war. When I used to, you know, repeat the no more war slogan just because Trump said that. So we'll see, my friends. There's lots of good things going on. I'm just pointing out a few things that bother me a little. And I will see you again soon. Got some good guests coming up right here on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. I was supposed to tell you at the beginning, make sure you like and subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. And please share it with somebody. You know, let's not be selfish. We got a good thing going here. Thanks for listening.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.